Hello and welcome to Tokyo Inklings. My name is CY. I am the founder of Qseido, and you can find us at qseidotokyo.com and on Instagram at Qseido. You can also find my personal account at Tokyo Station Pens on Instagram.
And my name is Jacob, and I am food fan on YouTube and sometimes on Instagram.
All right, Jacob. So it's been a while since we've talked on air. We've obviously talked off air privately, but how's it going?
Yeah, it's sort of Golden Week right now. It's an unusual Golden Week this year. We're a bit scattered, the holidays. But all is well, and I think we have the next few episodes of Andor dropping today, so all is well. Can't complain.
I have not watched anything past episode one yet because I kind of want to savor the moment. So I was watching and I finished episode one, and the Disney Plus thing, it skips to the next episode, or it says next episode. So um, just unconsciously, I pressed next episode, and it starts playing, and I'm like, no, 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 I want to wait for this. So I'm proud of myself for not absolutely binging the entire thing, but it's been pretty good so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I'm not gonna spoil it for you, but it's a masterpiece. I would say it's sort of peak Star Wars. It's something worth savoring. Yeah.
What they get really well is the kind of grittiness, um, the human element, as well as the super. Well, they don't really have like too much of like this Jedi supernatural stuff, um, but I think it captures a lot of what people like about Star Wars, unlike some of the other shows where I think you know all of those elements are still there, but maybe they're a little bit unbalanced. Whereas in Andor, it's really good at balancing each of those things that people love about Star Wars.
Yeah, and I think for me, and I think that whole generation of people who grew up with, in my case, the original trilogy, right? There's a lot of nostalgia there. I grew up like playing TIE Fighters, playing X-Wing, Rebel Assault, watching the movies, and it's a lot of nostalgia there. But when I watch the original trilogy now, it's a little bit, I mean, it's a bit shallow, right? So how do you make something? How do you make something that plays to that nostalgia, but it's more suitable for someone who maybe wants something with more in depth? So I think they did it
Yeah.
very well.
Um, and obviously, since we are a Star Wars podcast now, I I went to the Star Wars Celebration 2025 here in Tokyo just for one day, and I realized that I'm not a Star Wars fan because there are people who are crazy. Like they are dressed up to the max, body paint, walking around, not even just in the venue, but like just walking around the entire city. And it was pretty fun to see. It was fun to see a lot of passion in a not the same hobby because I think pen people can be crazy as well. But these Star Wars folks, they were pretty wild.
But you did manage to buy a ticket, and that says something about the level of fandom, right? By the time I realized that the event was in Tokyo, or Chiba, I guess, everything was sold out. Like all
Yeah,
types of tickets were sold out. There was no chance of buying anything.
I actually purchased it a few months after they announced the tickets, and by the time I could buy it, there was only Friday, which was fine for me because I work
Mm.
an irregular schedule anyway. But Friday was the first day, so why not? Um, and I was there for their announcement of Mall, so that was cool. I also got you some um, omiyage or souvenirs. Omiyage, as we call them in Japan. And I was originally struggling to think, okay, uh, I want to get Jacob something because I know he's a big fan of Star Wars, but don't want to spend like, hundreds of dollars. Uh, so what am I gonna get? And I got you this Mandalorian model kit, and then I was walking around the floor, and there was this booth, I suppose, with just like there were like nine vending machines just lined up. I was like, oh, what's this? And so they're selling these like oolong tea cans with these like older or with scenes from every Star Wars movie. And the funky thing is the wrapping. I hope you haven't already drank it and thrown it away, but the wrapping you can take it off and it's a sticker.
Oh, I didn't realize that. I
Yeah.
did not realize
So
that.
that's a pretty cool thing. So I got you two oolong cans. So I just thought that was so funny because they probably made more money at that booth than a lot of other booths without a single person manning it.
By the way, sort of a side note to a side note here, you said that like omiyage is souvenir in Japanese, but there's a bit of a difference and nuance there. I remember like, when I first came to Japan, started taking lessons, and there were these like dialogues you had to learn, and there was something to the effect of like someone received an omiyage and they said like, "Can I eat it now?" And that made no sense to me because for me, a souvenir is like, you go to Paris, you get a little mini Eiffel Tower keyring, right? It did not make sense that that's something edible. I've never heard of omiyage before I came to Japan, or souvenirs are something you would eat. It was just kitsch, right? So little stickers and like miniature versions of like landmarks, etc.
Yeah, a lot of souvenirs here are for eating.
Yes, for sure. That's a big industry.
Yeah. Um,
Should we try to unwind all of those tangents?
yeah, that's what I did. And I think this Star Wars celebration in Japan is so popular because the yen is so low, and we obviously see that reflected in the amount of tourists. Um, as you can imagine, having your city overflown with tourists is not something that most Japanese people like, but there's another person that doesn't like how weak the yen is. That person is apparently the president of the United States.
Nice segue. Nice segue.
And so I think the entire world knows now that the president of the United States, Donald Trump, um, he even said it on the campaign, right? Tariffs is the most beautiful word in the English language. And so there has been a big shift in global trade and also global like economics, I suppose, um, because of these tariffs that Donald Trump signed into uh, executive orders. So that they're not law, but they are executive orders. So they have some kind of um, I don't think they have. I think in theory they don't have legal binding power, but it does compel people who work in the executive to follow those orders. So it's kind of like a loophole to the law, as far as I understand it. Um, but I think there's several things to unpack here. The first is that initially, when the tariffs were announced, they were these crazy double-digit numbers, um, and for Japan, it was 24. So 24% on everything that is uh, shipped or created in Japan and shipped into the United States.
And this was, by the way, I think all of these tariffs we're talking about now, they don't replace existing tariffs. They're on top of whatever tariffs may be in place already, right? Which is why in some cases for China you see tariffs in excess of 200% because the 145% are on top of 100% existing tariffs, right?
Yeah. So, in any case, even if they were to replace or they were not to replace, these numbers are just absolutely bonkers. And so there are different things to unpack here. First is that the United States used to, well, I think most countries, but have this thing called de minimis. That's what the U.S. calls it. So it's basically a minimum threshold for import where you're exempt from import taxes. And we have this in Japan too, right? Like I think the limit is 10,000 yen. So if you import something that's less than 10,000 yen, you wouldn't be charged for the regular import fee. And then we have some trade agreements with places like the EU where because their customers would usually be charged VAT, um, so we would have to pay an import tax on stuff that we buy from the EU. Um, but usually there's some kind of a threshold, right? So for the US, it was $800, which is, by the way, an extremely generous threshold. But the executive order that was signed has now mandated that this de minimis exception be done away with, and there will be no more de minimis exceptions.
That's on May 2nd, right? That is
Yes.
the date everyone is looking at.
Yes. Oh, well, yes and no. Yes and no. So the language of the executive order when it comes to de minimis does not give any exceptions for any countries, but it does say that the removal of de minimis shall be in effect when the Secretary of Commerce informs the President that they have the logistical ability to collect upon those tariffs.
Mm.
So um, the the executive order is in effect from May 2nd, but when the de minimis will be taken away is dependent upon Secretary Lutnick informing the president. That's how I understand this this section of the tariff. There's also another section of the tariff, which we'll also talk about more in depth later, that completely removes the de minimis effective immediately of the signing um, from China and Hong Kong. So anything you buy from China, anything you buy from Hong Kong will be impacted by the 154% tariff
Mm.
and will not have de minimis exceptions at all, which, from my understanding of the text, and I did study economics, politics, and law, um, my understanding of the text, that means that with priority, anything that somebody who is in the United States, anything that you buy from Hong Kong or China will, effective immediately, not have any de minimis exceptions, which means that if you purchase something that is $10 and there's a 154% tariff, you're paying $20, $25.40 because you have the additional $15.4 of tariffs they have to pay. So that obviously makes things a lot more expensive.
Yeah, and I think it's worth discussing in a bit what this means for the Chinese pen makers. There's some interesting nuance here. There are some something they can leverage that we'll talk about. But I think it might be worth starting with looking at it through the lens of the Japanese stationery companies that we are familiar with. And just to preface this, that was saying, obviously, if you're not in the stationery industry, then stationery is probably pretty low in your list of concerns when it comes to the tariffs, right? There are a lot of more serious concerns, but us being a stationery podcast, I think it might be worth looking at what this means to the stationery industry, especially the Japanese companies. And I think usually the two companies that are easiest for us to analyze because the data is there and we understand it well are Sailor and Pilot, right? And I think when you talk about the impact of the tariffs, there's obviously the immediate first order effect. There's actually the immediate effect of the tariffs themselves, but then there are all these other kinds of second order effects, and the two big ones, especially affecting these two companies that come to mind, is first how this impacts the gold prices. That's a whole topic in itself. And the third one is...
Ooh, that one is
Yeah,
something that I wanted to bring up later too.
we can dig
Yeah.
deeper on why this is happening and so on. But then the third factor here, I think, is just consumer sentiment, right? So if you start with a company like Pilot, and they don't actually have any manufacturing in China, it's in Japan, it's in Indonesia, it's in India, and elsewhere. So while they will be affected by the 10% tariffs initially, it looks like they're not going to be immediately affected by the very steep tariffs on goods from China. And on the topic of gold prices, we have previously talked about how the Lamiki division and more in general the fountain pen part of the business is minuscule. It's more about brand image, more about the history, more about who we are, than something that drives sales. If you look at Pilot sales, there are product in the stationery segment. There are products like Friction, and there are products like G2. There are the mechanical pencils like S20, etc. Those are the products that really drive sales. So while steep gold prices may well affect the Ramiki division and the few custom pens they sell, I don't think overall that's going to make a big dent for them. And in terms of consumer sentiment, since the product they make, they are the big sellers. They are like school supplies, they're office supplies. Even if you are worried about what's going on, you're not going to stop buying a Friction, you're not going to stop buying a G2, you're not going to stop buying office supplies. I don't think you're going to see a dramatic drop in sales. Well, this is just me guessing, but
You might stop losing them.
yeah. But so all things considered, I believe that Pilot is relatively well positioned to weather this storm. I mean, we won't know for sure. I know that their next earnings report will be in early May, but that will be for the quarter that ends in March, and you won't see any impact, of course, in March. You will see their outlook. You might see some words that hint of what they think about this. Maybe their plan for it, but you're not going to see any real impact until the next earnings report after that, which is 4 months away. But if we look at Sailor, I think it's a very different situation. Here again, if you look at the first order effects, Sailor's manufacturing is in Japan. It may well be that they are piggybacking on some of Plus's facilities in China for Tuesday and so on. I don't know if that's the case, but I think that's a possibility. But Sailor themselves, I mean, they do most of the manufacturing, if not all manufacturing, in Japan. So the first order effect, I think, while noticeable, won't be that severe. It is a secondary order effect that will be really problematic for them. I mean, gold prices, of course, we will talk more about why this is happening, but that's going to be a major problem for them. But then even the bigger one is the consumer sentiment, because high-end fountain pen, which is the driver of Sailor's sales, that is very much discretionary spending, right? That is exactly the kind of spending that you will pull back on when you're uncertain about the future of your job, your retirement savings, etc. Right? So we already talked in previous podcasts about how Sailor there are dark clouds, and they're even darker now, I would say. So my view is that while Pilot may weather this storm relatively well, I think we're going to see real problems for sailor. That's my view. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm not very happy about that. I agree with you. Um, I want to add a little bit of additional nuance there on the pilot thing, though, because while I think it's probably true that pilot doesn't have much, if any, manufacturing in China, they probably import materials from China. So I'm talking like plastics, metal, uh, whatever they use in their gel and oil pens. Like I find it very difficult to believe that that could all be manufactured in Japan or Vietnam or whatever else, just because making stuff is very complex, and you have to you have to get stuff from different places, even if that's not where you manufacture the final product. So I do think that they do have stuff from China, but the good thing is once they, I suppose, create the thing, it doesn't have that made in China label, which actually might be a good thing for non-US companies, because now Chinese factories who are producing these raw materials have to find new buyers, and that potentially could be a an incentive for these Chinese raw material producers to cut some better deals with non-US manufacturers.
Just to look a bit closer at what you're saying here about importing from China. So my understanding is that if after importing materials, say from China, if what you do, your assembly qualify as, I think the trade term is substantial transformation. Basically, if you turn it into a final product, then you can say it's made in whichever country you did that substantial transformation. So the only scenario where pilots, if I understand correctly, would have to pay tariffs on materials from China is if they do the manufacture, if they do the assembly in the US, right? But if they import from China to Indonesia and they do this substantial transformation in Indonesia, and now they have a pen that is made in Indonesia, now they're subject to, if they import that to the US, then that would be tariffs from Indonesia. Is that correct?
You're correct. I'm talking about when Pilot buys this thing from China and imports it into Vietnam or whatever for assembly or production, right? China was selling, let's say they were selling like 100%. No, let's say they're selling like 80% of, for example, steel or titanium or whatever to the US, right?
Yeah.
Now instead of 80%, they're selling 20% to the US. So the other 60%, they got to find buyers, right? So I'm saying the non-US companies may be able to get a better deal from these Chinese manufacturers because they're shifting gears to find non-US buyers.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Ironically, it seems as if this would drive manufacturing away from the US, right? Because if you import the raw materials to the US and do the assembly in the US, then you're going to be subject to tariffs, right? But if you import into another country and you do this substantial transformation in another country, now you're not going to be subject to Chinese tariffs when you sell the final good in the US. Right?
That's right. That's right. At least that's how I understand the situation. So that's the thing on Pilot, and yeah, I do agree with you that Sailor is, as we say, screwed, because they rely so much on this, as you call it, discretionary spending, and that's a problem that we face at QSADA as well, right? Like we have a very expensive product, but I think Sailor. I was I was at Staya in Daikanyama yesterday. They were having this event with with this calligraphy focused event, and there was a calligrapher who collaborated with Sailor and produced um, a full sized Pro Gear. And you remember the good old days when a full size Pro Gear was 20,000 yen, even as a limited edition. This
Yeah.
time they were selling the Pro Gear, but in sets with the calligrapher's postcards, or like there was a Toos collaboration set as well. I think with a Toos pen stand, and they
Okay.
were selling it for a whopping 100,000 yen.
Times have changed.
I was uh I was talking to the folks, and asking, hey, are you gonna be selling these individually? And they're like, yeah, they are, but it's still gonna be, a it's gonna be a price. So I'm gonna send you the photo of the the prices. And the pen is a good looking pen. But the pen with the postcard set starts at 85,800 yen. And without the postcards, I was told that it would probably be closer to maybe 70 plus thousand yen, which is, that's a lot.
This looks like the kind of pen that, as you said, would be in the 20,000, 30,000 yen range just a few years ago. It looks
Yeah.
like, yeah, one of those like cocktail pens, right? And I remember I bought my first Sailor cocktail pen at Old Fashioned at Maruzen, a full retail price like 22,000 yen a few years ago.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. Um I I mean the pen is pretty cool, but it is very expensive. And I think sailors, we've talked about this to death, but sailors reluctance to move away from their 21K, and even for their collaboration items now, they're not using 21K, they're using 18 karat, but they could definitely reduce that carat
Mm.
number down to 14, but they just won't do it. So I think you're going to see their prices rise even more, and maybe we can go just dive straight into how this impacts gold.
Yeah, let's do it.
So Jacob, you're more of or you're more integrated in this banking finance stuff than me, but tell me what happens when the US dollar is unstable and why gold prices increase.
These are complicated factors here, but one thing that has been, explained to this in media is that, normally what happens is that when the stock market is volatile, people go buy treasuries instead, right? That is the safe haven. But the unusual thing happening now is that people are selling not only US stocks, but they're selling US treasuries as well. They're getting out of the US market altogether, right? And the question is, well, where does the money go then? And it has been discussed how you've seen a lot of renewed interest in Germany's equivalent of treasuries, so Bund. I probably botched that pronunciation, but also gold, of course. So this may not be the only reason, but we have seen gold prices rising rapidly in the last few months. So it seems as if it is, viewed as an even safer haven now due to the political instability in the US.
I think also because uh, when the world moved off of the gold standard and onto the dollar standard, the dollar, as you say, became that safe haven, right?
Mm.
Um, but with these tariffs, as well as other, I think, geopolitical matters, happening. I mean, just in terms of the messaging from the White House, I think some countries are now no longer very confident in the dollar standard, because I think if you are looking at it from a non-US perspective, obviously people in the US, they don't really have to care because they just work in dollars. But from a non-US perspective, you're looking at dollars, and you're seeing the White House trying deliberately to devalue the US dollar in different ways, right? So um, in the tariffs, but also in other ways where people's people's perception of the U.S. Right now could be, oh well, you know, things can happen overnight, and the U.S. can say A today, and then tomorrow they'll just say B. And so the reversal of a lot of previous administration policies, including reversals of Trump term one's policies. So like what was the free trade agreement that replaced NAFTA? It's UFMCA, right?
Mm.
Um, Makes, I think, foreign countries and foreign investors feel unsafe keeping their assets in dollars, and therefore, I think they want to take their assets away from dollars and move them into something safer, which traditionally has been gold. Now maybe some Bitcoin as well, but traditionally has been gold. And I think I'm obviously simplifying a lot here, but I think that's why you're also going to see a much stronger spike in gold prices. And I was listening to a different podcast yesterday, and apparently you can see something interesting throughout the day is that when Asia wakes up, people are selling dollars. And then when London wakes up, people are selling dollars. And then when New York wakes up, people are buying dollars. So um, I think what this means for the stationery industry is any gold nib is going to uh, probably and justifiably increase in price. And I know that from 2-ish years ago, since we started QSATO, gold prices have skyrocketed. It's probably closer to like 50% more than what we used to pay for gold just 2 years ago,
Mm.
which I hope some of you are invested in gold because you'd be rich now.
It's true, gold has gone up. So if you're unfortunate to be a fountain pen manufacturer, you're really sort of caught up in the geopolitics, and the material that you need for production has suddenly been something that investors worldwide are stockpiling, and that's not good for you. So the question then is, the perennial question that comes up all the time is, of course, what do you replace gold with in your fountain pens?
And um, it's not just the nib, right? If you're into like urushi, they
Mm.
use a lot of gold powder,
Mm.
so we expect that to be increased in price as well. But you're right. What do you replace gold with? Because steel, I just don't think it has the same prestige. Um, Especially, if companies have bottom lines, right? And gold is has more prestige and is more expensive than steel nibs. You're thinking, okay, if I sell this pen with a steel nib, let's say, for example, this will never happen, but if Pilot decides to replace all of their gold nibs with steel nibs, right? And you're not buying an 823, and right now I think it's like 40,000 yen, but um but let's say they change it to steel nib and they're like, okay, now it's 15,000 yen instead of 40,000 yen, right? How much more are they really going to sell almost 1.5, or even more times the number of A23s in order to make back their bottom line profits so that they can pay all the folks that work at Pilot.
Yeah, and if this was a huge industry, you will see a lot of incentive to do all kinds of experiments with the materials, trying to come up with alternatives. But given how small this industry is to begin with, right, it may be hard to justify trying to come up with alternatives. It's just like mad scientists like Ian Sean that is really doing anything unusual here, right? It's just hard to justify like R&D into small business.
I will tell you that there are experiments going on. There are experiments going on. It is to protect the consumption of the industry, but there are things that are going on. But I think what's difficult about this industry, especially if you're into gold nibs, is that you're actually being hit with a double whammy. Because the first is, obviously we've talked about gold prices skyrocketing due to geopolitics. And usually gold prices only skyrocket because of geopolitics. So because of geopolitics, it's increasing. So if you like gold nibs, then you're already paying a lot more for that. On top of that, with the tariffs, so actually it's a triple whammy. So on top of that, with the tariffs, if you're from the United States, you expect to pay at least 10% more because of the universal tariffs, right? But then
Yeah.
on top of that, because so many things in the United States are imported from China, right? Including the machinery that they'll need to make stuff in the United States, right? Um, so you're gonna, in my opinion, you're gonna see a large lift in the cost of living, unless you also raise wages, which I guess is not so easy. So you're going to have that, which means that the general consumption power of the United States is going to decrease because you have the same wage or maybe marginally higher, right? But you're paying at least 10% more on most things, or at least 10% on everything. And if the crazy number doesn't go away, an additional at least 154% more, so 1.5 times more from anything that comes from China, which is a lot of stuff.
And then you have another factor from the consumer's perspective that makes it even worse, right? You're going to see shortages, right? I heard recently in an interview with the CEO of Flexport, one of these big customs brokers and logistics firms. He said that like ocean shipping from China is down 50%.
Yeah.
And so what you're going to see is empty shelves. So you're going to see higher prices. So this is highly inflationary on top of everything else that's going on.
Yeah, so the challenge with this industry is that the US is a major consumer of goods. Um, and so just speaking from QSATO's perspective, we've got at least 80 to 90% of our customers in the US. That's a lot. You're talking to a store like Box. A lot of their customers are in the United States. You know, Pilot has Pilot USA for a reason, right? A lot of companies have secondary subsidiaries in the US because it's such a huge market. Hobonichi, I think half of their book sales, overseas market book sales, goes to the US. So what you're going to see is a lot of these companies they've hired to grow, and you might see a lot of pain in that. So I would expect a lot of those prices to go up. And I've been talking to some industry insiders as well. They have no idea what to do. And the problem is not necessarily the tariffs, because if it's a one-time thing, we know, okay, everything's just going to be 10% more expensive. We'll just mark it up 10%. But the problem is, well, this 10% might be 20% tomorrow or 30% the next day. So how are you going to manage that? And from a business perspective, you are by definition going to be a lot more risk averse. You're going to hunker down and you're going to take the least risky way out, which may just be to increase your prices by 20% and hope that whatever tariffs come won't go higher than that.
And then on top of that, the irony is that the Chinese pen makers might actually be able to handle this better than, the Western pen makers that import from China. So again, going back to this interview with the CEO of Flexport, one thing he mentioned is that in the US, you don't need to be a US legal entity to import goods. You could be, for example, a Chinese company, and I think like 60% are like the merchants on Amazon Amazon US, these are outside. Probably a lot of them are Chinese entities, right? So they are not even US entities. They import, and that means they are highly incentivized to undervalue their imports because they rarely get caught, and if they get caught, that is impossible to enforce because the U.S. customs have no ability to penalize a Chinese-based entity. All they can do is blacklist that organization. But here's the thing: they can just start up another shell company in China, and here's the kicker: if they do that, they get to keep, and this is all from this interview with the Flexport CEO, they get to keep their Amazon merchant account, right? So you have this merchant that they undervalue and they get away with it until at one point they don't. So they get blacklisted. They start a new entity. They keep their account. They keep the product listings. They keep the reviews. They keep everything. So they're just going to rinse and repeat, undervalue the product, which might mean that you're going to see your Moonman and Hongjian, etc., still be affordable. So maybe in relative terms, they may be even more affordable compared to pens from other pen makers now than before.
Well, unless it's, I mean, you're seeing the classic, um, like economics 101 problem, right? About um, about goods, um, about like how people prioritize um, their spending. I think they are called Giffen goods,
Mm.
where um, a product whose demand increases when prices rise. So I guess because other pens are more expensive relatively and you have a limited pool, you'd still buy the cheaper one even though that price has been increased as well. So ironically, people may be buying more of those Chinese pens. I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I think, I mean, we could honestly do this entire podcast about tariffs. um, but yeah, it's challenging for sure, and a lot of companies are now shifting their focus away from the US because it's clearly a dangerous prospect for a lot of companies. So, um, in other hobbies, so like this model kit building hobby, um, Bandai is one of the bigger players there, and they're now reshifting their focus to Europe. Um, some people are reshifting their focus to Southeast Asia, uh, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how the world trade rebalances itself. Um, I, 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 I think it is very unfortunate that folks in the US will have a decreased spending power. I don't think that it's positive for anybody because the US was, I think, the largest consumer in the world. I think there's a lot of talks about trade deficits, but um, I don't think trade deficits mean anything. People just don't like to hear the word deficit. The real deficit that should be focused on is the budget deficit, which I do agree is a big problem. The trade deficit, I think, is not an issue whatsoever. But we'll see. We'll see. Who knows? I'm not the president, so I'm obviously not smart enough. But yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, I mean the consensus seems to be that it will disproportionately affect smaller companies, smaller medium-sized companies, because they don't have the ability to lobby, bribe their way into exemptions, right? And they don't have manufacturing at different parts of the world. It's harder for them to switch manufacturing. And again, I keep coming back to this interview with this Flexport CEO. He said that, okay, let's say you want to switch from China to Vietnam. If your lot size is 500, they're going to laugh you out of the room, right? Because you're going to be at the end of that queue. All that bigger companies who have much bigger order sizes are going to get priority now as they shift their manufacturing. So it is the small companies that are going to be hit the hardest. And unfortunately, given the nature of this stationary business, it's a lot of small companies, right? This is not the domain of the mega corps, right? So I think we might see some of these companies we know and love really struggle in this environment.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think so. Um, hopefully people still love and buy pens. And I hope that our listeners will be minimally impacted from this tariff. Not just tariffs, but it's a mostly geopolitical um, challenge, and yeah, we'll see. Nobody's talking about central banks now. Nobody's talking about interest rates now because I think that's just not super interesting anymore. Um, all people care about are tariffs.
And of course, as we said, stationery is probably pretty low on the list of people's concerns unless they are working in this business. But yeah, we hope that the companies that we know and love are going to be able to weather this storm. So one final thing about sailors. So we talked about all the problems sailors are facing, but there's something really interesting going on. So if you look at sailors stock price and trading volume, it's a small cap, kind of uninteresting stock. It has been trading in the 100 yen range for a while, and the trading volume has been around 10,000 to 20,000 shares for a while. Then suddenly, on I think March 26th, trading volume went 300-fold into the millions. The stock price jumped over 40%, and for the last few weeks, we've seen this pattern repeated where every few days the trading volume has been sky high compared to the normal volume, and the price has been surprisingly high and hasn't really been backed by any news. So if you try to look for any kind of announcement from Sailor, any kind of industry news, there hasn't been anything obvious that would justify the price increase or the trading volume. But it turns out what seems to be happening, and this is being reported widely in the news here, there seems to be what seems to be happening in Japan is that there's a criminal organization, it's believed to be a criminal organization that has accessed a lot of people's personal trading accounts on brokerage accounts. And they have used that for market manipulation. They have propped up especially small cap stocks. And this is like a really big topic right now in Japan, and has been investigated by FSA, which is kind of sort of Japan's equivalent of SEC, but more their responsibilities are broader. So there's something going on here. It's not clear why Sailor is included in this, because again, kind of sleepy, boring stock, but suddenly trading volume has skyrocketed. The price has gone up a lot, and it's come down a bit, but it's still surprisingly high, because there's nothing else. There's nothing that would otherwise justify it. But if you look at the discussions, like if you go to like Yahoo Finance, for example, you have this like a discussion board with, the amateur investors are just chatting, and you have sort of this feeling of this being a meme stock almost. People are just hoping that I'm gonna invest, it's gonna go up, and woohoo, it's going to the moon, right? I'm not sure what the relation to that is to this suspected criminal activity, but it may be sort of two factors at once here now, that while it was initially caused by market manipulation, now it may have kind of become something of a meme stock, which is really strange, because again, there's nothing there that would justify the volume or the increase in the stock price.
When you look at these numbers, you look at this volume, it's hard not to think that maybe there's some kind of money laundering going on here.
Yeah, I'm sure. I hope we will be hearing more about it, because again, FSA is key choice investigating. So hopefully they'll figure out what's going on. But from Sailor's perspective, they could take advantage of this while it lasts.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, so then going back to another company that we know and love, Nakaya, they've had a distribution agreement with nibs.com for more than, I think, almost 15, 20 years. I don't remember exactly how long it's been, but a long time. And for a long time, you could only get Nakayas from nibs.com if you were trying to buy in the US. They also had their own exclusive shape, the Nakai, which was quite beloved. But last year, I believe, a couple years ago, nibs.com was sold. Marsha left the company, and last year, Nakaya quietly dissolved their distributor relationship with nibs.com. But from what I understand of the drama is that they allowed Nibs to sell their remaining inventory, and Nibs has continued to advertise Nakayas, and so they were selling non-existent stock and taking money from customers, selling Nakaya, which obviously they wouldn't be able to fulfill because Nakaya is no longer, selling to nibs.com.
Mm.
So they actually, they as in nibs.com, got dragged online for, not being able to deliver, I think rightly so. And then I believe what happened is that nibs.com sent out this rather snarky email about how Nakaya had betrayed them and had wronged them, and how, nibs.com was trying really hard to, work with them, but Nakaya basically just left them out to dry. And then you had this other press release from Nakaya saying, hey, we don't know what's going on with nibs.com. We dissolved the relationship with them because they filed for bankruptcy. So obviously they can't continue to, sell our pens because that company is going bankrupt. So there's this like weird drama going on with nibs.com and Nakaya now. But if you're in the United States and you're trying to buy a Nakaya, do not purchase through nibs.com because it is very likely that your order will not be fulfilled because Nakaya are not playing nice with nibs.com anymore. And so you'll probably most definitely not get that pen.
Looking at this newsletter that you forwarded to me, there are two things that seem particularly odd to me. One is that the way it was phrased, nibs.com made it sound like the bankruptcy of this MVP pens or whatever the legal entity is called is sort of like a side note, not even central to the story. And then the second thing they mention is that they said something to the effect of, we are not charging customers for the orders, and also we were supporting Nakaya through this whole Wajima earthquake, and the implication was that they were the ones having to pay left and right, while if you read feedback from customers, that does not seem to be the case. And then the other thing, we discussed this a little bit a few weeks ago, and I think I told you that I don't believe Nakaya will say anything because it's kind of not really sort of normally the Japanese way of doing business, right? You would sort of just stay quiet, wait for it to blow over, and like don't make it a bigger trouble than it is. Like not worth it. So the fact that Naka even responded with their own press release, I think, is noteworthy here.
Yeah, so I saw on Reddit, I believe. I don't know how you feel about this in particular, but there's this guy on there's obviously these threads on Reddit talking about Nakaya and what they should do, who's in the right, who's in the wrong. People love this kind of drama, but I think some person was talking about how should people or how should these companies respond to this? And there's one particular comment that said, this is from u/particular song 3539, or sorry, u/particular underscore song 3539, and they say, to me this reply feels like Nakaya has completely washed their hands on anything nibs.com and unwilling to get involved with follow-up to help out the paid customers, which is quite unusual in most Japanese businesses. I could say it's kinda selfish of them to quote-unquote abandon those who pay to buy their products. But it can also be read that they must have had bad final interactions with nibs.com. Now all the paid customers are left in midair with no help at all. Sad. So another person replies, why would Nakaya be responsible for claims towards a third party that they clearly stopped working with? This is not a €100 mass-produced pens. It sucks, but it's not on Nakaya to fix it. And then the original poster said, yes, that's rational at how things are dealt with in Western countries, but it's not uncommon in Japan that businesses decide to step in and offer some sort of compensation to the clients. What do you think about this? Do you think Nakaya has to do anything for the customers that basically got I don't know if scammed is the right word, but they're obviously not getting their pen or their money back.
I don't know enough about the nature of this deal that they have. So I'm unqualified to say anything. My layman's view would be that they probably don't have any responsibility here. But again, I don't really understand what's going on here. And I'm not sure that's necessarily what they're trying to achieve with this press release. I get the impression that they were almost forced to put that out because they probably got a lot of questions directed at them, and they wanted to explain what's actually going on.
Do you think Nakaya has any responsibility towards these customers who might have paid? Or do you think it's just totally on Nibs?
My layman's opinion would be I don't think they do, but again, I don't really know enough about the nature of the deal they had and how that works, so I'm a bit unqualified to say anything.
Yeah. I mean, this is definitely a sticky situation and not one that a lot of companies, especially Japanese pen companies, find themselves in. Um, but I think just because of the quirky nature of Nakaya, who really they should have been distributed through Luxury Brands of America because that's who distributes Platinum. But yeah, it's just funky, weird gray area that really could only happen because of the way that Nakaya is structured, right? So, um, feel bad for those who have ordered Nakayas from Nibs, but you know, it's strange to see a Japanese company embroiled in such kind of dramas.
Yeah, and I think it's sad for Nakaya also because this is on top of they already, of course, they already have struggled with the aftermath of the Wajima earthquake and what it has meant for their business, right? So they're in a tough situation.
Yeah. Speaking of brands that are in a tough situation, and we're almost at the end of this podcast, but do you want to talk a little bit about Ohashido?
I can't remember if we mentioned it last time, or maybe we didn't. Yeah, so Ohashido was they were supposed to be at this year's Marsden spring like a retail event. There was even like mentioned in the little postcard we got, and it was, I think, I mentioned in Shimano Bungobaku as well. I was working on a YouTube video about like small Japanese pen makers, and I wanted to feature Ohashido, so I started to look for I want to just see what's going on with Ohashido, and I noticed, hey, they're gone from Instagram. Their online store is gone or was emptied. Their Twitter account is gone. Something is really... what's going on? And I didn't see any discussions on social media. And I happened to have the reason to go to Marsden that day anyway. So I asked them, just, is Ohashido going to be at this year's spring event? And they said, no, Ohashido is not coming because they have gone out of business, or haigyo is the term they used. And that was, of course, a shock, because Ohashido has in one way or another been around since 1912. So depending on, how you count it, you could see that Ohashido was older than both Pilot and Platinum. No, Ohashido wasn't really incorporated that way. So, but still, they have a long history. And they went out of business. I've seen some theories as to why that may have happened, but I haven't seen anything from Uehara-san himself. But I have seen confirmation also from someone who contacted Uehara-san directly and got the confirmation that Ohashido is no longer in business. And in fact, you can see that he started a second online store where he said, Ohashiro is no longer in business, but I have some remaining inventory that I'm selling over here. Maybe he couldn't use his original account because it was under the organization, which no longer exists. So we know that Ohashiro is out of business. We don't know for sure yet why that is, but there have been theories about it.
Yeah, and lately Ohashito pens have been kind of wild in design. And I remember you asking him about it one year, and he said, "Oh, well, his customers prefer now the more like strange designs, right, as opposed to his father's design, where they're more classic."
Mm.
Um, but it's funny because if you look on like Mercari or Yahoo Auctions, the only stuff that sells is the real classic stuff. So I wonder if, I mean, part of it is, he's old. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's sad. I wonder if there's a part that misread the market there. Um, Another part is maybe just didn't feel the passion for making the pens anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say whether he was forced to do it or whether it was just time for him to retire and no one willing to take over the business. I mean, I think both are plausible. We know, of course, that he was heavily reliant on Sailor for the nibs, and he had this unusual agreement where he got these custom stamped nibs, and I don't know if that's the case, but someone mentioned that it was difficult for him to source the nibs. I don't know if that is true. I don't know if that was the cause of it, but that's plausible.
Yeah, so very sad news for folks that have been into Japanese vintage pens for a while. Ohashito, obviously, they will
Yes.
be missed. All right, final topic. Let's talk about this $30 stack nib.
I was looking at AliExpress. Can't remember what I was searching for, but somehow this $30 to $40 uh, nib with like a sailor style stamp, but stacked, came up and was available in 1.6, 2, and 3 millimeters. And it wasn't just from one seller, it was from multiple sellers. So it wasn't just some homebrew thing. It's not clear who's actually making them, but they were available from various sellers. And of course, I was intrigued because obviously stacked nibs tend to be expensive, even the steel versions, because there's labor involved, and this better than most people. The success rate is not always 100% when you make these stacked nibs, so there are all kinds of factors involved that makes this typically an expensive thing to make for many people. So it's very surprising that someone is able to sell these for $30, but I bought 2 of them, and they are surprisingly well made in a sense that the stacking and like especially like the nib tipping alignment is so precise it looks like it can't possibly be handmade, which makes me think that someone, whoever it is, has figured out a way to make these stacked nibs with a machine, which I think is the only way to explain the price point as well. There may be still some hand-finished parts of it, but given how incredibly precise these nibs are stacked, it makes me think that some Chinese manufacturer has figured out how to weigh these stacked nibs with a machine. And if that's the case, I suspect we're going to see more of it. So I made a video about that, and one of the comments I got was, how do you think this is going to affect CY's business? And I said, I don't think it's going to affect it at all, because I think there are whole different markets. But so what is your view on this as a pen maker and a sort of stacked nibs expert?
Yeah, the welding is very good. The writing is just okay, lacks character. Um, And I think it's telling that they're not doing this in gold. So we don't know about the failure rates. We don't know how well it works. We don't know how it's done. We do know that it's impressive. Um, and at $30, they're not making money from this because, I mean, it's it's a big time commitment if you're doing this by hands. But we're gonna. I think with the gold nibs, there's a little bit of something else that it's being asked. I guess it's like, well, now that you can make AI art in movies, will people go see movies in the movie theaters again? And I think, as you said, it's a different thing, right? Like when people buy our stack nibs, I think they look for a degree of professionalism and a degree of perfection, but also I don't think they want it to be exactly perfect. I think a lot of people like seeing that, oh, there are some scars to this, that they like to see the evidence that it was made by hand. And to me, that's a part of the charm.
When you're buying an expensive fountain pen, sometimes, I mean, you're not just buying a product, you're buying a story, right? How was this made? Who made it? What goes into making one of these, right? And I think that's part of the value proposition, right?
And I think you're right. Yep. But nonetheless, these should be fun alternatives for people to play with. I don't think they'll ever really replace the artisan work, but they're definitely funky. And if you just want fat, might be the way to go.
So I bought a 3mm version, and I never seen that much tipping on a fountain pen nib before, which makes me want to give this to a nib grinder and see what kind of like ridiculous like sharp architect or whatever they can make of. Because as you said, while the welding is impressive, the nib grind is kind of bland and boring, right? But with this much tipping, you can do anything, right? And it will be really interesting to see what a skilled nib grinder can do with this much tipping.
Yeah. All right, then thanks everybody for listening. Thank you for bearing with us through our Star Wars segment. And also, this is now we are now the Phantom Menace podcast. We only talk about trade routes and how it impacts geopolitics in the galactic, the Republic. But okay, none of that nonsense now. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Tokyo Inklings. My name is CY, and I run QSado, and you can find us on QSadoTokyo.com and at QSado on Instagram. You can find my other account on Tokyo Station Pens on Instagram as well.
And my name is Jacob, and I am Furufan on YouTube and on Instagram.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.